This is the Biz News Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
Leadership consultant and author Annette Simmons says the current climate of divisiveness is working against collaborative approaches to problem solving. But she says there are positive changes coming as women gain influence in business and politics. That's because women often see things in a moral context, she says, a vital balance to the competitive systems that tend to drive too many decisions. Annette Simmons talks about her research and the solutions it offers to divisiveness in this Biz News interview podcast. You write on one of your websites that the most inspiring stories narrate self-sacrifice, helping without payback, showing good faith, and illustrating moral norms. Nobody could argue with that, except how on earth does that fit in with business in the United States in the 21st century?
Well, in the 21st century, we're beginning to realize that competitive narratives will devalue sometimes moral wins. Only because things are reduced down to zeros and ones, these self-sacrifice can look like weakness. In a highly competitive political environment, listening to someone looks like you're willing to be a loser, you're betraying your tribe. And so in the 20th century, that worked fine because we didn't have all these algorithms more narrowly defining win-lose in situations that are really about collaboration. Now, we've reached the point of diminishing returns. Competitive narratives only cause harm. And so collaborative narratives go about defining a problem differently. We include people who weren't included when it was only whoever talks the loudest wins. And we're beginning to realize that we have to reclaim these collaborative narratives and dial down the competitive narratives so that they can blossom and create meaningful jobs that have become less meaningful, the less able people are to show kindness, which gets reduced as inefficiency in statistics, and harm avoidance specifically. In a competitive narrative, harm is just the cost of doing business. So you've heard the phrase, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. Well, that's become a narrative that everybody just assumes that you have to do harm in order to win. That phrase originally was used in the French Revolution to justify murdering people. And so competitive narratives systematically devalue harm avoidance as if it were the same as risk avoidance. And the two are different. And so now corporations, those who want to survive and want a climate that we can survive in, are beginning to dial back the competitive narratives and also dial back their love of certainty.
Would you explain what you mean dialing back their love of certainty? Surely you have to be certain if you're going to run a business successfully.
And that's been the narrative, that certainty is superior, that certainty is the goal. The problem with that is that if you don't embrace uncertainty as a future event, you don't prepare for it. And so certainty turns into arrogance. And the competitive systems will end up reducing down, for instance, let's look at the Texas power grid. Where in that circumstance, certainty is that we have enough based on the averages, and they stopped the redundant systems that would have that aren't needed most of the time. But in a crisis like they had, people died, and so it's this love of certainty that actually undermines our ability to prepare for uncertainty.
So many of our political leaders seem to be so certain these days, and they get quite a bit of a following.
That's a major part of why we're in such a divisive circumstance right now. If you look at, for instance, conservative or liberal politics, one of the paradoxes that they turn into a conflict is the idea of whether safety is more important or freedom is more important. And so if you have these highly certain, it's all about safety or it's all about freedom, it ends up anybody who wants to crawl down that ivory tower and actually go talk to the other side, we're the ones that get branded as betraying the goal. And yet safety and freedom are two sides of a paradox that has to be dialed into a little. Every time you increase safety, you might lose some freedom. And every time you increase freedom, you might lose some safety. And acting like it could be resolved once and for all, acting like one party has the answer, causes us to deny that the answers are all in the middle.
How did you reach this conclusion in your philosophy? Where did it start, and what was the progression?
Well, I was trained to be a winner. And my dad wanted me to go to law school, and I was the best that I could be. I always made A's. And so, and I turned into what I call the action plan queen, which is my approach to psychology. Was like, let me just slice somebody's head open and shove stuff in. Just teach me how to do that and I'll be fine. Well, of course, that's impossible. And the other thing is that as the action plan queen, I tended to focus on control as if that was going to help. For instance, when I was working for J. Walter Thompson, sell more cars. But if you are all about control, what happens is that you squeeze out participation. And so I'd come up with these plans. I'd have a strategy. Of course, I thought I was right. And maybe I was. It doesn't really matter. Even if I was right, coming up with a strategy by myself, giving people dates and deadlines is a way to disengage their feeling for whatever the strategy is. I've had to learn, in order to be successful, how to dial down the control and increase the participation. And so my first book was about turf wars, territorial games. And then I wrote a book called A Safe Place for Dangerous Truth. I mean, you can see a trend here. I'm writing what I'm learning. And then finally, the story factor, which is probably the most valuable collaborative technique. Instead of trying to convince somebody you're right, what better way than to go and ask people what their story is and learn some more and find out that you're all right, just like the 5 Blaine men who are holding on to the elephant, arguing to the cows come home that it's wide and flat like an elephant. Well, you're an idiot. It's round and stout like a column. And so we end up in our politics right now. We have the two parties arguing in a way that actually casts people who collaborate as traitors, arguing that an elephant is safety or an elephant is freedom. And the truth is that it's both. And trying to understand that we have two narratives, at least, running at the same time is not a function of being unfocused or wishy-washy. It's a function of a bigger picture, and of finding out the truth. Even the ones we don't want to deal with are really important in order to come up with how we define the problem and affect how we go about the solutions.
How do you spread that idea throughout the society so it takes hold and becomes the predominant way of doing business, so to speak?
Well, so far I've been sneaky. I've been infiltrating from within. So if you look at all of my books, I've been trying to usher collaborative narratives in. Territorial games, for instance, that book, the title of it, I'm sure that there were people who bought it because they wanted to find out how to fight territorial games better as a playbook. And yet it doesn't take long, if you're just telling yourself the truth, that these games grind genius into gruel. And so I was able to deliver on innovation. I was able to deliver on engagement, the ability to facilitate dialogue, a safe place for dangerous truth. I remember facilitating Air Force intelligence, very high level group, where they actually sat down and asked themselves the question, how did we find evidence of weapons of mass destruction when it wasn't there? And these are the kind of conversations that need to be happening more and more often. Reevaluating what it is you thought was true. Instead of being certain, being uncertain on purpose in order to learn more.
How do you get the American people, I guess people worldwide, to accept uncertainty as the core part of life, so to speak, and to deal with it when they seem to gravitate to people preaching certainty?
Well, let's look at the people who are preaching certainty. My interaction, I mean, I write these books and anybody can read them, and a lot of people have, and that's great. But I'm really more interested in the logistics of systems that force certainty onto what is uncertain. And so my book is really for people who want to include more collaborative narratives in their systems, but these systems have been designed based on competitive narratives for decades, maybe centuries. And there are logistical impediments. Now these things have turned into algorithms. And a lot of people call it male bias. I would call it competitive bias. But in order to change the way the system evaluates women, if you're going to have more women on the board, and people already know from just profitability that it's a good idea to have a mix of men and women, what is it that causes women to leave? And what is it that causes, and I won't just say women, but those with collaborative narratives to leave, is that these systems are set up to only reward the competitive players. And we have to make some changes to the systems in terms of how we define a problem. For instance, parliamentary procedure is built on the adversarial idea that you have an argument and one wins and the other loses. But collaborative dialogue, defining problems with collaborative narratives, is a function of taking those two stories, finding at least another three more, because they're there, and then defining what the problem is, because it's going to look different.
Now, of course, everybody has a story. That is essentially the motto of our company over the years in interviewing people. That everybody does have a story, and oddly enough, everybody's interesting when you come right down to it.
I've always said the truth. If I teach storytelling, and people are like, well, what if my story's boring? And I'm like, tell the truth, because that'll make it. And this happened to me. I was talking to an old retired minister who was writing history of the church. And he said, it's just so boring. And I said, well, tell the truth. And he goes, what do you mean about the affair I had with the S&M minister, two towns away? And I was like, well, it's gotten more interesting already. But that's what the thing is that if you tell the truth, if you try to be polished and professional, you come across as plastic. And being who you are and telling your story from your point of view, without acting like you're superior, just saying you do have a point of view, that's what we want to value.
In a business sense, when decisions have to be made, somebody has to essentially come out on top with the decision of the day or the hour to move the project forward, so to speak. So how does this work in an everyday business environment? What have you advised companies?
Well, you say somebody has to come out on top, and that's an assumption that's embedded in competitive systems. The other way to look at it is the group has to make a choice. And these choices, for instance, between safety and freedom, since I brought that up, these choices are going to be a little bit towards safety one time, a little bit towards freedom another time. And so the idea is that we are managing paradoxes where there will never be a single solution, a resolution, and then we automate it and walk away. So what I'm asking people to do is to pay attention to how they define problems. It's not somebody has to come up on top. It's a different set of skills for a group to make a choice. And those choices need to be seen as impermanent. Because this idea that we're going to be able to solve things once and for all and walk away has caused the problems because we've just walked away with the assumption we had solved them, and we haven't. And so we need to go back in and develop some skills that are different to whoever comes out on top. We need to establish some values that everybody has a point of view, and that it's a richer and more sustainable solution when you have a richer and more sustainable definition of the problem. So
Wow.
for instance, one of the stories, so I ask women to tell me a story about a time you were powerful, men and women, but women would tell stories that men didn't tell. And so I got an example of one of those stories that might help clarify. Robin was in her house, the doorbell rang, she went to the door, and there's a guy out there that says, "Is your husband home?" And she said, "Well, I don't have a husband, but if you have a question to ask me." And he said, "Yeah, we're going to have to chop these trees down." It was the power company. And, I don't know if you've had a house with trees, but eventually they're going to come for your trees. But in Robin's case, she said, "Wait a minute, your poles aren't straight." Now, from a competitive point of view, they had identified the problem as getting the trees off of the wires. And so that was their only solution. And they were trying to cut down her trees and cut a few branches before she climbed up into a tree with her family Bible and started reading out of Genesis. Not that she's religious, but it certainly stopped the tree cutting. And they went away finally and came back with executives in nicer and nicer cars saying, "Ma'am, we need to cut these trees." And she would say, "Come with me," and walk them outside and have them with their own eyes look and say, "Do you think this pole is straight?" And there's no way they could say it was straight. And she said, the problem is that you need to straighten your pole, not cut my trees." And ultimately, a very nice car, probably a Mercedes or a BMW, drove into her driveway, and they said, "Ma'am, we've decided to straighten the poles." And she was like, "How wonderful an idea." And so that's an example of how when you have multiple narratives, you end up redefining the problem in a way that you can't see when you're just going at it one versus the other.
Yeah, and she ought to be awarded for perseverance, especially against an electric utility.
Well, that's women's narrative is perseverance, and it's much more highly valued, and also in terms of it's more focused on sticking to our narrative, and that's the reason I wrote the book. Women's voices need to be heard. I have seen how women's voices, women, me in particular, we've been taught that we're unfocused, that we're too emotional, that we're wishy-washy. But what we are is multi-focused. We use emotional intelligence at the earliest stages of problem definition, not just how to implement solutions. And when we define a problem, we're including the strategies of power with as opposed to power over. And in a competitive frame, it looks like power with, which is you bring everybody and listen to everybody and have people make group decisions. That looks like weakness to someone who only values power over. And so we're trying to, and it's not one or the other. We can't say we all collaborative narratives, no competitive narratives, because life doesn't work that way. We need to learn how to toggle back and forth. It's what I call perceptual agility between both, and to optimize the combination of both points of view or 5 points of view so that we have a better grasp of what our problems really are right now, what we need to be paying attention to, and how we're going to solve them.
Take a moment to tell our viewers and listeners about your new book. The name of it is
Drinking from a Different Well: How Women's Stories Change What Power Means in Action. And this book is because our narratives are personal. I started the chapter just saying what my experiences were over the last 30 years working as a female in government and corporate situations. And then I share my research, which is the stories women told me that men just didn't, because it's not that gender is a binary, it's a continuum. But just because we are no longer coerced into choosing the gender that we were born with doesn't mean that gender is meaningless. And so there are certain values that are considered feminine, certain values that are considered masculine. A lot of us have both in us, but it's important to see the stories that women told, and they were stories that used power to avoid harm in a way that would never show up on a profit and loss statement. Avoiding the harm of climate change, for instance, nobody's going to get a bonus for that. The use of collaborative techniques to define problems, which women tend to refer to as power with instead of power over. And then I wrote about the evolutionary theory that we are different for good reasons, and that we're a team. And so sexual dimorphism occurs in all species, and that is non-genital related gender differences. And if you look at us as a team in terms of evolution, you can see that one group tends to be identified with masculine, is more concerned about taking care of their tribe, their own family. And then another group is really more interested in taking care of the collective, not just my family, but other families as well, which tends to be attributed to more female circumstances. But the two, either one by itself would be failure, but the two together, which we need to reintegrate these more feminine narratives, are actually a survival strategy. And then I go into the logistics of competitive systems, how these things have been designed out of the system, how collaborative narratives are actually punished in the system right now. And then I talk about women who speak up, who persevere, what it is we face. I use the research from the 10 territorial games. We face people who say, sure, we're going to do that. I'll get right on it. And you're thinking, no, you're not. So I think it's useful to anticipate the territorial games that competitive players will play, and come up with solutions that don't cause you to just shut down, actually keep you sane, keep you talking, keep you persevering. And then finally, I use the myth of Cassandra in the last chapter to illustrate that battle narratives, in this myth, the Trojans the Greeks told them that they won, they surrendered, and they wanted to give them a big gift. Here's something that we just so admire you, as victors. And inside that gift, the Trojan horse, of course, were all these Greek soldiers just waiting till they get drunk and they crawled out to kill everybody. But there's this character named Cassandra. And in the myth, Cassandra is characterized as being cursed by the god Apollo, that she could see the future, but no one would believe her. I don't think it's the curse. I don't think it was Cassandra that was cursed. I think people who are so embedded in battle narratives that all they can see is the glory of the next win. These are the people who actually can't hear, because their narrative defines avoiding harm as being weak or not brave, not courageous. And so I point out that it's the battle narrative that actually silences the voices of Cassandra. Not that she was cursed by some god. It's less magical than that. When you're using only a battle narrative, you just can't hear the voices that want to help you avoid harm.
Would you take a moment to give our viewers and listeners a website where they might get more information about you and your books?
Thank you. Yes, the Different Well has its own website, and so if you're purely interested in this most recent book, the website is www.differentwell.com. Now, my storytelling, turf wars, the 30 years of consulting, you can find my work on AnnetteSimmons.com. And I welcome anybody to email me with your thoughts about the book at AnnetteSimmons.com. I enjoy dialogue, and I'm always looking forward to hearing from people.
Annette, would you now, I've asked you a lot of questions. You've been very good about giving detailed answers, but what would you like to talk about that we haven't gotten into yet?
I am very interested in the men who say that they want more women in business, and yet want the women to act like men when they come to the business. So if a woman has a collaborative narrative, it's important to see how the ranking systems actually skew towards rewarding competitive narrative game players, if you will. Life is not a game, and so we had this whole wave of, you got to gamify it, you have to turn it into a game, and that's only attractive really to people who like games and competition. And not everybody does. Some people like collaboration. We like potluck. We like, to celebrate everybody's birthday at work. And that's not nothing. That's actually a very important part of creating collegiality and opening the pipelines of information so that they flow rich and full. And I would love to know that those people in power who say they want women to be in the top levels of the C-suite and the board of directors, I'd like to know that they were realizing that this system needs to be redesigned, or else women are going to continue to walk. Women leave work when it feels immoral, and it's no fun anymore. And so we need to reintegrate moral concerns into our company policies and goals, and change the system so it actually rewards the people who pursue and achieve these moral wins.
You've been watching the Biz News Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. Thanks for watching.